going through a bit of a series, Are We Living the Way? And I'm talking about today the Gentiles. When did the Gentiles come in? And next week we'll be doing how were the Gentiles, the people of the nations, dealt with in this new sect of Judaism, and we'll be taking a look at that. I have a volunteer to hand out. Could you pass those out? Tomorrow I'll be at the Baptist Church in Whitewood, Black Hills Baptist Church, talking about Shavuot, or Pentecost. And that should be exciting. I'm always thrilled to talk about God's appointed times and what they mean to us. Of course, it's 2 weeks until Shavuot or Pentecost. And so we'll be, of course, dealing with that here as well. So last week we looked at how Judaism of the first century BC and AD was not monolithic. They didn't think the same way. They didn't do the same things. Different sects of ancient Judaism were doing different things. The Zealots were all about overthrowing Roman rule. These are the four major ones. Zealots, overthrowing Roman rule. The Essenes were separatists, perhaps a bit like the Pharisees, although they thought the Pharisees, I think, were a little too liberal, if you can imagine that. But they also took over working in seclusion, preserving copies of the scriptures. They were also known to kind of going overboard on wanting to be ritually clean by doing mikvahs 4 or 5 times a day. And so they really wanted to be ceremonially clean, which the Pharisees thought was kind of silly to be doing that often, since you only needed to be ritually clean in order to go up to the temple, but maybe because they were copying scripture too, they wanted to. And then there were the Sadducees, who were in power thanks to the Roman government. They were getting kickbacks. The family of Caiaphas was very wealthy, and they had a lot of money that they were making. They were corrupt. One way in which they were corrupt was the money that they made from exchanging Roman currency or anybody's currency into the temple currency. They charged an extra price on that in order to make money, which they shouldn't have been doing. They were also known to tell people that their offering wasn't good enough. Here, buy the one that we have set aside. And so they were making extra bucks off of that as well. And then the Sadducees also did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, while the Pharisees did. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. They were well liked by the common people because they were not aloof or as aloof as the other 3 groups. They sought to put up boundaries around the commandments so that the people wouldn't inadvertently mess up and become either sin or become ceremonially unclean. And so they set up these boundaries. And it appears that in their desire to set up the boundaries, they had good intentions in doing that, but they neglected some degree of justice and caring for people in need. And Yeshua calls them out for that. It wasn't that they were doing everything wrong, but they were setting up these boundaries. And the reason why the Pharisees and Yeshua spar so much is that the Pharisees respected Yeshua, or else they wouldn't have cared. They wouldn't have had conversations with him and asked any questions. And so when we see these questions being asked of Yeshua, and sometimes the text says that they were testing him or challenging him or something like that, it was out of respect. Because if he was unimportant, they would just ignored him, you know. So we need to realize that when we're reading the scriptures. So, like people should do with the teacher, the Pharisees were challenging Yeshua to see if he really thought the things that he was saying. And you could do that by asking some provocative questions, or even sometimes nonsensical questions, just to see what the response is. Testing out, are you really that good of a teacher? Or do you really believe those things that you were saying? And when we understand this, then we understand that when they challenge Yeshua, they're looking for consistency, and quite possibly they are legitimately wanting answers from him as a rabbi. And also, Yeshua's teaching were really very much like the Pharisees. There were a few things that they may have differed on, but you can see where a lot of the teachings are what the Pharisees were teaching. And I think part of that came from a rabbi in the first century BC by the name of Hillel, who was teaching. And I think, this is my personal opinion, that Hillel was priming the pump. Hillel lived for 100 years in the first century BC, and so he had a lot of students that kind of, in my opinion, he was priming the pump. God set it in motion. Let me be clear about that. That I think God used Hillel to kind of prime the pump here. And another thing that you can see, and where I say Yeshua was a bit of a Pharisee himself, is that Yeshua was setting up boundaries. You read Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, as was brought up earlier, murder. If you have hate in your heart, you've already murdered, and those things. That's setting up another boundary. So if you think that Yeshua was tearing down those boundaries that the rabbis had set up, not so much. He was setting it up a little bit bigger, but primarily so that we would see what the main emphasis is on, that being a heart issue. It's not, when you read the Ten Commandments here, those things the negative ones can be heart issues, or should be heart issues. And when you drill down to it, don't try to make loopholes and trying to get around doing the right thing, because it's the heart that you need to look at. I rabbit trailed, and now it's time to get back here. Oh, I was going to say, I mentioned this last week too. Dr. Rabbi Daniel Boyarin says that one of the sparring sects between the Jerusalem Pharisees, I'm wording that wrong. There was when we see some of the dialogue going on between Yeshua and the Pharisees in Jerusalem, part of what we're seeing there is the Pharisees of Galilee were having issues with the Pharisees of Jerusalem, with the Pharisees of Galilee thinking that the Pharisees of Jerusalem were going overboard on these boundaries and adding things in. Remember the washing of the hands? Where is that in the Torah? And it has to do with the priests before they go into the temple or the tabernacle. It had nothing to do with washing your hands before a meal, but that boundary was set up. And so the Galilean Pharisees are pushing back Apparently, the Jerusalem Pharisees wanted to do more things like that, and the Galilean Pharisees are kind of like, let's just get back to what the Scripture says. Stop it. Let's not be doing those things. I had another thought there, and it kind of went away. Yeah, maybe it'll come back to me later. So there were other sects of Judaism as well. Those are the top four, but there were other sects of Judaism. So the harmony among ancient Jewish people came in the Torah itself, even though there were variations of the way that it was carried out. And so there was this central part of the Torah that kept the Jewish people together, even with these different variations that were going on, including Messiah and how Messiah was going to come. And so there was a particular way of thinking about Messiah, especially that he would be king, he would overthrow the Roman government, and so that was part of the thinking of who Messiah was going to be. Is Yeshua going to be the one? That question is asked, in Acts, the first chapter of Acts, I believe. And the question is asked, is the time now? And they're looking for the overthrow of the Roman government. And we've had talks in Torah Club about, in the end times, we have a particular view of how the end times are going to work out. But will it be different from that? Certainly when Yeshua came, he didn't come the way that a lot of people thought that he was going to come at that point. And you go, well, it was clear from the Tanakh, from the prophets, from the scriptures, that Yeshua was going to come and do certain things, that Messiah was going to come and do certain things. But a lot of people missed it at the time. And thank goodness for that, really, or else we wouldn't be sitting here today having this conversation. God works in mysterious ways. But we need to keep in mind, especially for end times, that things may pan out not the way we expect it to go. So, anyway, that's a recap of last week, snapshot of ancient Judaism in the first century, and it's a very incomplete snapshot. But one thing that I want to add to that is that Judaism didn't begin to consider itself as a religion until the 1800s when Reformed Judaism started. Up until that time, it was thought of just as a way of life. This is the way things are. We live our life, a God-centered life. And it's just involves everything that we do, not as a religion. Judaism was and still is very much a way of life with God at the center every week, anchored with Shabbat, week after week. The annual reading cycle is instilled to instill a desire to learn and study. And God's appointed times, the biblical holidays come year after year, and so we're refreshed all the time with God at the center of life. Torah taught and teaches us how to live a life in covenant with God and have a relationship with Him and with other people. So today, let's go, I want to go back to Genesis, work our way forward, because the question, according to the graphic, is about the nations. The children of Israel are the chosen people. They're chosen for the task of being a light to the nations, keeping the scriptures, God's word, and proclaiming that God is the God of the universe. There may be little gods that are floating around, but they're just idols. This is the God of Israel, who is the God that you should be watching for. And they were supposed to be bringing forth the covenant relationship between God and Israel. So the question this morning is, when do the Gentiles show up in this covenant relationship between God and Israel? Is it Cornelius around 40 A.D. or so? Is it Acts 15 when the Jerusalem Council meets and they have to decide how are we going to deal with these people from the nations as they come in to this faith as Yeshua followers? Or was it much later? And if you were here in the 9 o'clock hour, it was much earlier. Much earlier. Genesis chapter 12. First we'll look at Abram, verse 1 of chapter 12 of Genesis. Then Adonai said to Abram, get going out of your land and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. And then down in verse 4. So Abram went just as Adonai had spoken to him. Also Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarah, or took Sarah his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions that they had acquired, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they left to go to the land of Canaan, and they entered the land of Canaan. When Abram left Haran, he crossed over Canaan, and the word for crossing over is Eber, and so from there came Hebrew, the crossing over, or passing through. And when he crossed over, he wasn't by himself. Apparently, he was out evangelizing because he brought not only possessions, but all those that were with him. And so all these people crossed over. They were not Jewish. They were not Jews, which comes later. And it traced back to the beginning of the children of Israel, the name that Jacob received after wrestling with the angel. So technically, Abram was separated himself to God as a Hebrew, a person who crossed over, passing through Canaan. Was he of the nations? He was of the nations before they knew that they were the nations, that there was something other. When Abraham was getting really old, he wanted to make sure that Isaac had a wife. He put his oldest servant in charge of going out and finding a wife. They went up to the well, his servant went up to the well, and this is outside of the land that this is taking place. And if you go to Genesis chapter 24 and verse 4, it says, on the contrary, to my land and to my relatives you must go, Abram says, and get a wife for my son Isaac. But the servant said to him, suppose the woman were to be unwilling to follow after me to this land. Should I then have your son go back to the land that you came from? Abraham said to him, see to it that you don't return my son there. And so the servant gets there, the woman at the well, she brings them to her house. Her name is Rebecca. The family wants to keep her home, though. The family doesn't want her to go. And so she is asked whether or not she will go with the servant. And Genesis chapter 24, verse 57, it says, so they said, we'll call the young woman and let's ask her opinion. And then they called Rebecca and said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. And so they sent Rebecca, their sister, off with her nanny and Abraham's servant and his men, and they blessed Rebecca. And then she went off. And she's from the other side, and so she's being brought in. So compared to the Hebrews, she is of the nations. She is being brought in. Compared to the Hebrews, she is a Gentile. She's from the nations. Interestingly, it's almost a picture here, or is a picture here, of when you were called by God. And people are holding on to you. The world is holding on to you, saying, we don't want you to go. you know, and you say, I'm going to go. I'm going to follow Yeshua. I'm going to go. And hopefully those other people will give you their blessing. Sometimes they don't. A lot to unpack in Genesis chapter 24, but the point for today is that Rebekah, up until this point, she's from the nations, and when she crosses over, she's going to be a Hebrew. And then what about Rachel and Leah? Genesis chapter 29, Rachel came with, it says, Rachel came with the flock that belonged to her father, for she was a shepherdess. Another well story here. Now, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob stepped forward and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. And again, the family member, not a Hebrew, until again she crosses over. Both Rachel and Leah. And so you can consider them being part of the nations. And it's important to avoid compacting all of this and saying Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah were Jews, or even of the children of Israel. The three of them were from the nations. The wrestling match between the angel and Jacob hasn't taken place yet when they come down. Out of these marriages came, with Jacob as the father, the 12 sons who are the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we have an original Hebrew, because he's born of Hebrews, marrying from the nations and developing the whole 12 tribes of the children of Israel. The thing that we can see here is that drawing the nations in was nothing new. God used it time and time again. They were brought in early on. And we know also from Scripture that a mixed multitude came out of Egypt at the Exodus. And in the Torah commandments and the ordinances and the statutes, there are provisions for the sojourner and the foreigner. Those are people from the nations. They were living amongst the Jewish people in the wilderness and in the promised land. Things became a little bit confusing, though, during and after the Babylonian exile and the captures of the Assyrians, because those people were having relations with the Jewish women. And so who was the father? That was a big question. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, the lineage was determined through the father. But with the Babylonians and the Assyrians and all that, who was the father? Who was to know? And so then the lineage was, it was determined that the lineage would be determined through the mother, because you always know who the baby comes out of. We don't know who the other party was in the making of that baby necessarily, but we know who the mother is. And so it switched to a maternal lineage. So that switch was made, and I think it was a practical one that made a lot of sense, because you always know who the mother is. But not all of Judaism around the 1st century AD and BC agreed with that, and so we have two family lineages in the Gospels to take care of that issue. Even today, there is a difference of opinion as to whether it's Jewish lineage is through the father or through the mother. Still that way. When we get to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, Gentiles attaching themselves to Israel was far from a new thing. Cornelius was a God-fearer. He was one who recognized the God of Israel. He even donated money to the temple. But he didn't go to synagogue. But he prayed at the times of the sacrifices. And he wasn't an isolated case. There were many who were doing that. How many? I don't know. But there were others who were doing it. So it was nothing new. The children of Israel were chosen to be a light to the nations, but they're also supposed to stay separate from the nations, not to pick up the bad practices and be influenced in a bad way by the Gentiles. So when we get to this episode with Cornelius, something that's brought up is the rabbinical teaching, the oral law, if you will, of saying that you cannot even be in the house of a Gentile. You know, so the extreme was reached where, no, you're not supposed to pick up their bad habits, and then the extreme was, well, don't have anything to do with them. Don't have interactions with them. We could go to those extremes too, of, hey, we want to be separate from the world, but we don't want to be separatists. We need to be in the world so that we can be a light to those that are around us. And as we get into that first century period, we can see where things have kind of gone astray. And the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is very clear that their descendants are to be light to the nations, but it's very difficult to be a light when you're not willing to be exposed. You're not willing to discuss things with other people. Isaiah chapter 56. Isaiah lived in the early 700s BC, about 740-ish, plus, however long he lived. And so this was way, way before Yeshua, the first century AD. Isaiah 56, verses 5 and 6 says, also, the foreigners who joined themselves to Adonai to minister to him, to love the name of Adonai, and to be his servants, all who keep from profaning Shabbat and hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. The burnt offerings and sacrifices will be acceptable on my altar, for my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. Adonai Elohim, who gathers the dispersed of Israel and declares, I will gather still others to him, to those already gathered. So already in 700 BC, we see that the nations will be brought in. Nothing new going on. The temple, the house of prayer, will be for all nations as God gathers others to come alongside him. None of this is new to God. There was never a plan B. What may have been very, very different was that the Gentiles wanted to be especially involved with this sect of Judaism called the Way. And so maybe that's what the real issue is here that's taking place, and why things are getting kind of hectic with trying to figure out what to do with the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are interested in this sect of Judaism called the Way and really flocking in, but maybe not so much with the rest of Judaism, if you will, at that time. So the Apostle Paul, Shaul, understands what is going on here is a Messianic movement. The time of the Messiah is at hand, and Peter understands this too. It's a time to actively engage with Gentiles, and God is having the Gentiles respond. We already know from the scriptures that myriads upon myriads of Jews were coming into faith with Yeshua, so becoming part of the sect. A myriad was maybe 10,000 people. So if you have a myriad upon myriad, 100,000 people, Jews, that are coming into faith here. And so when people say that, the Jews rejected Yeshua, you really have to define who rejected Yeshua. Because after the crucifixion, it says myriads, upon myriads were coming into the faith among the Jews. Anyway, so imagine being there 20 to 30 years after the resurrection, and all of this is happening. These Gentiles are wanting to come in. What would you do? On one hand, you're trying to protect the faith, right? And yet you've got these Gentiles coming in. How are you going to handle the big influx? You look at 20 or 30 years as being a long bit of time, but not so much. What do you do? Most of normative Judaism of that day is keeping an arm's length to the Gentiles. But here's the sect called the Way saying, come on board. But then when so many are coming in, it's what are you going to do? So far, what we've got over today is that, number one, it has always been the plan to include Gentiles. Rebekah, Rachel, Leah voluntarily attached themselves to Isaac and Jacob. They weren't forced to. Rahab and Ruth voluntarily attached themselves to Israel as well. They weren't forced to attach themselves to the God of Israel. And the Gentiles coming into the sect of Judaism, called the Way, were voluntarily attaching themselves to the God of Israel. And now, because someone coming into the Way was coming in from a pagan life, it might see Judaism of the first century as a religion. What do we do? What transactional relationship do we have to have with the God of Israel in order to have a relationship with God? But Judaism historically is a way of life. It's how you lived. It reflected who you are. And it's way beyond religion. It just permeated everyday life. We're not operating in religion here. There's no transactional relationship with the God of Israel. It's a covenantal relationship. And the Jewish people of the first century sect called the Way needed to be a guiding light to the Gentiles, show them the road, guide and direct them on this new path that they're on. You have to be crazy, I think, to be the new kid on the block telling everybody else how they should be doing things. And so you didn't want to have a situation where the Gentiles are coming in and saying to the Jewish people, hey, this is the way you need to do things. It's got to be the Jewish people are saying to the Gentiles, this is our faith, you've entered into it, this is the way things are done. This is the way to have a relationship with God, not the other way around. But some people are crazy enough to do that. We call them Karens today. They're the ones that think that they're in control and they're the only ones that have the right answer to it. If you haven't run into a Karen, you don't want to. They think they've got the better way of doing things. So what does that have to do with today? Well, Judaism is still supposed to be a light to the nations. Yet it struggles with being that light by being so protective, so defensive. There are elements of Judaism that are getting out there to talk to Christians. And one of those people will be Jeremy when he comes on July 2nd. He's one of those. And there are other groups that are just starting to do that and seeing that if we don't dialogue with each other, we're not going to learn. Jewish believers can provide the teaching of Torah and the writings of the prophets. For instance, in our reading of Matthew this morning, about the wedding, the servants of the prophets, and helping to understand the Brit Hadashah, like in this morning's passage that we read, that if you don't have that Hebraic background, that Jewish background, You're just going to read it as servants and the king, and the parable isn't going to make. And it's a good parable, but it makes a lot of difference when you understand that the king is God, and that the servants are the prophets, and that the people not coming to the wedding are the children of Israel who aren't responding. And then okay, well, that makes sense. It's not just a parable that's hanging out there. And then Gentile believers need to be a light to the Jewish people by showing, hey, look, I can live a biblically righteous life as a Gentile, following the Scriptures, maybe even knowing the Scriptures really, really super well, and that provokes the Jewish people to follow Torah even closer, to get into a covenant relationship. Gentile believers will be like Rebekah and attach themselves to Israel so closely, perhaps, as being Torah pursuant, which isn't that hard to do. But it'll be a remnant. You didn't see all of Laban's family going. The same, Rebekah went. And the same happens amongst the Gentiles, where you have people of the nations who come into faith in Yeshua and say, okay, that's good enough for me. And then you have others who come in and go, I really want to make a closer attachment to the children of Israel. Not becoming Jewish, but learning more about the Scriptures and Torah and how that life is lived, even if I don't fully live that myself, being aware of it. And then it just triggers something among the Jewish people who saying, wait a minute, this is weird. You're not supposed to be doing that. And they go, well, yeah, technically I am. Let me show you in the Scriptures why I am supposed to be this way. And when Gentile believers are wholeheartedly living out the commandments of God as disciples of Yeshua, it drives Jewish people back to that covenant relationship, and at the same time, removing that veil so that Yeshua, the Messiah, can be clearly seen. So they go, what's different? And so what it winds up being is that Jews and Gentiles coming together, even coming together in Yeshua, or especially coming together in Yeshua, it's a complementary relationship. Paul gets into this a little bit in Ephesians, or gets into it a lot in Ephesians, about the organism of the body of Messiah. The hand doesn't say, hey, I want to be a foot. The brain doesn't say, hey, I want to be a buttock. Oh, well, for some people it does. Hold up your sign. And so when we have Jewish believers and Gentile believers getting together within the Messianic movement, it's a complementary relationship. It's not one is better than the other, but one has different callings, different gifts that they bring to the table to make everything work out. We need to understand that God has brought us together to glorify Him. Every heavenly being can look and see, oh, wow, those humans, they're operating in unity, even though they're not all the same. It's a testimony to the heavenly beings. And I could go, wow, the ones that God chose, the children of Israel, brought Messiah into the world. They taught Gentiles, and now both believing Jews and believing Gentiles live in harmony, helping each other out to become better guardians of the Scriptures, of faith, and of each other, growing closer in our relationship to God. So that's what I want to project today, is that it was nothing new to bring the Gentiles in, but why bring the Gentiles in? Because it provides an opportunity for us to have complementary relationship with each other. It's not a them in those, but there are different things. I personally believe that the Jewish people, even in Messiah, are called back to that covenantal relationship with God where you're faithful to the Torah all the way. For Gentiles, I believe that they're called into a covenantal relationship with God that has to be discerned. We'll talk about this more next week, how the Holy Spirit works in that relationship. And I don't want to give my secrets away, so I'll wait on that until next week. Baruch Hashem.